A quiet afternoon interrupted. The sky above Pinecrest Lane stretched out in infinite blue, scattered with the occasional lazy wisp of clouds that drifted like white cotton candy. Trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling quietly, a peaceful suburban melody. It was the kind of afternoon Calvin Harris cherished deeply, quiet, orderly, uncomplicated. At 36, Calvin had spent years meticulously sculpting this life for himself. Working remotely as a web developer, he had the freedom to choose solitude and routine, and he guarded his privacy jealously. Calvin's neat, single-story home, painted a modest shade of beige, blended seamlessly into the neighborhood. His lawn was impeccable, his hedges squared with surgical precision. On Pinecrest Lane, he was the polite but distant neighbor, a friendly wave, a cordial nod, but never one to linger in conversation. His reputation was solid and consistent, quiet, respectful, private, exactly how Calvin liked it. On this particular Wednesday afternoon, Calvin was more preoccupied than usual. Recently, his reliable internet had begun betraying him. Video conferences jittered, movies stalled mid-scene, and even loading simple emails felt like an eternal punishment. Initially, Calvin blamed the issue on weather conditions or a faulty cable, but soon suspicion settled in the back of his mind like an itch that refused to fade. Perhaps someone had hacked into his network. It sounded absurd in his quiet, safe neighborhood, yet the nagging feeling persisted, prompting him into action. Calvin set aside his keyboard, rubbing the bridge of his nose in frustration. Pulling his phone from his pocket, he opened the router's admin page. He scrolled cautiously through connected devices, noting each one. Calvin's laptop, home speaker, smart TV, phone 01, all familiar and accounted for. But then, at the bottom of the list, a strange entry glowed faintly in the digital darkness. Pinecrest Surveillance 07. Calvin's brows furrowed. His pulse quickened slightly. Surveillance. That couldn't possibly be legitimate. Not on his home network. Calvin was the only resident, and he had not installed any additional security devices. Who else could possibly be accessing his internet? He stood from his home office chair, feeling a need for fresh air to clear his thoughts. Slipping on his shoes, Calvin stepped outside into the bright, welcoming afternoon. Birds chattered cheerfully in the branches overhead, oblivious to his concerns. He moved slowly down his driveway, eyes glued to his screen, fingers tapping quickly and urgently. He didn't see the curtain across the street twitch or notice the suspicious glare directed at him from his neighbor's front window. That neighbor was Eleanor Drake, 62 years old, a retired school librarian. Eleanor considered herself Pinecrest Lane's unofficial neighborhood watch. She had always regarded Calvin Harris with a quiet sense of unease. Something about his persistent solitude, his polite but distant nature, irked her traditional sensibilities. She couldn't articulate why exactly. It was more a gut instinct, rooted in fear of the unfamiliar. Today, Eleanor stood frozen behind her lace curtains, squinting suspiciously across the street. Calvin lingered at the end of his driveway, hunched over his phone with unusual intensity. Eleanor's mind leaped to conclusions immediately. He's always been a strange one, she murmured to herself, heartbeat quickening. What's he up to now? Calvin, oblivious to Eleanor's growing suspicion, continued his detective work. He disconnected the mysterious device from his network, swiftly resetting his Wi-Fi password, his fingers moving with expert precision. He stepped a few feet further down the driveway to improve his signal, completely engrossed in the task. That was when Eleanor's anxiety boiled over. She imagined the worst. Calvin hacking bank accounts, spying on his neighbors, maybe even doing something far worse. Fear tangled rational thoughts into panicked knots. Without giving herself the time to reconsider, she grabbed her cordless phone from its charging cradle and dialed 911, her voice quivering with conviction. Pinecrest Emergency Dispatch, came a calm voice on the other end. What's your emergency? Yes, please send someone immediately. My neighbor, Calvin Harris. He's acting very suspiciously. Eleanor's voice cracked slightly as panic tightened her throat. Suspiciously, the dispatcher echoed, patient yet probing. Could you describe the situation more specifically, Mom? Eleanor struggled momentarily. How could she articulate what her gut insisted was true? She stammered nervously. He's standing outside, messing with his phone in a way I've never seen before. He's secretive, antisocial. Something's off. I know something's not right. The dispatcher, trained to remain composed, gently pressed Eleanor for concrete information. Has he threatened anyone? Is there reason to believe someone might be harmed? No, nothing explicit, Eleanor admitted reluctantly. But trust me, something's wrong. Can you please just send officers to check it out? After confirming Eleanor's address, the dispatcher assured her, officers will be there shortly to investigate, ma'am. Eleanor hung up, her heart racing with a mixture of apprehension and righteousness. She stepped back to the curtains, clutching them nervously, watching Calvin with unwavering vigilance. Meanwhile, Calvin had successfully updated his Wi-Fi credentials. Satisfied, he slipped the phone into his pocket, stretched, and turned to head back inside. He paused abruptly, noticing the approaching sound of an engine. Turning his head slightly as a police cruiser rounded the corner, moving directly toward his home. An uneasy tightness gripped Calvin's chest. He stood motionless as the vehicle slowed, eventually stopping directly outside his neatly trimmed hedges. Two officers emerged from the patrol car. Officer James Reed, tall and stern-looking, and Officer Lisa Monroe, her sharp eyes quickly assessing the situation. Officer Reed approached cautiously, maintaining a measured but firm distance. "Good afternoon, sir," he began. "We received a call regarding suspicious activity at this address. Could you tell us what you're doing?" Calvin exhaled slowly, irritation mixed with disbelief tightening his jaw. "Suspicious," he echoed, a slight incredulity in his voice. "I live here. My name is Calvin Harris. I'm just resetting my Wi-Fi password." Officer Monroe tilted her head slightly, evaluating him closely. "Do you have identification to verify your residence, Mr. Harris?" Though annoyed, Calvin recognized the futility of protest. He produced his ID, handing it calmly to Monroe, who examined it carefully before returning it with a brief, apologetic nod. "Mind telling us why someone might have found your actions suspicious?" Officer Reed inquired softly, his posture visibly relaxing after verifying Calvin's identity. Calvin's eyes drifted subtly across the street to Eleanor's curtained windows. Her silhouette was faintly visible, watching keenly from behind the sheer fabric. He sighed quietly, understanding dawning on him like a reluctant sunrise. "I honestly have no idea," Calvin answered tiredly. "Maybe someone saw me standing outside, focused on my phone. People jump to conclusions, I guess." Officer Monroe glanced toward Eleanor's house, clearly understanding the unspoken implication. "I'm sorry to trouble you, Mr. Harris," she said carefully. "We're obligated to investigate every concern, no matter how trivial it may seem." Calvin nodded understandingly, though annoyance still simmered beneath his patient exterior. Officer Reed's radio crackled, interrupting their conversation. The dispatcher's voice sounded tense, urgent. "Officers on Pinecrest Lane, we just received a secondary notification from Cyber Investigations. Suspicious online activity traced back to that street. Advise immediate on-site inquiry into possible unauthorized surveillance." Both officers exchanged a sudden, alarmed glance. Calvin's earlier discomfort returned, now shaded by confusion. Officer Reed turned sharply toward Calvin, his eyes serious, determined. "Sir, you mentioned changing your Wi-Fi password. Why exactly?" "Someone was using my network," Calvin answered carefully, dread prickling up his spine. Officer Monroe stepped forward, the calm in her voice strained. "Mr. Harris, can we take a look inside your router settings immediately?" Calvin's throat tightened slightly. "Absolutely," he answered, heart quickening with a foreboding sense that the afternoon's minor inconvenience had just spiraled into something much darker. Neither Calvin nor his neighbors could yet comprehend the depth of the trouble lurking in the shadows of Pinnacrist Lane, a danger hiding behind curtains of suspicion, ready to burst forth with a truth far more disturbing than any of them could possibly imagine. Shadows within the signal. Inside Calvin's living room, the mood was heavy, thick with tension as he placed his laptop carefully onto the polished wooden table. Officer James Reed stood rigidly near the front door, eyes scanning Calvin's meticulously organized home, a blend of minimalism and technology. Officer Lisa Monroe leaned closer, attentive, watching as Calvin swiftly pulled up the router's login page on his laptop. His fingers danced swiftly across the keys, logging in to reveal a detailed list of connected devices. Calvin's throat tightened slightly as he searched through the list again, hoping irrationally that the mysterious entry he'd seen earlier had simply vanished. But it was still there, stubbornly present. Pinnacrist Surveillance 07. Officer Monroe frowned deeply, her expression growing more concerned as she leaned in closer, reading the screen carefully. "You're saying you don't recognize this device?" Monroe asked softly, studying Calvin's face for any flicker of deception. "I have absolutely no idea whose it is," Calvin replied, maintaining eye contact to emphasize sincerity. "I've only ever had a handful of devices connected. That one's new, and it definitely doesn't belong to me." Reed shifted closer, visibly suspicious. "Could someone have hacked into your system remotely, Mr. Harris?" Calvin hesitated briefly, considering the implications. "Technically, yes, it's possible, but difficult. My network is secured. The person doing this would have to know something about network security, or at least be sophisticated enough to bypass it." Monroe straightened slowly, her face hardening with seriousness. "Show us the activity logs, please. We need to see exactly what this device has been doing." Calvin clicked rapidly, navigating through the settings to the detailed logs. Silence fell over the room, heavy and oppressive, as each second felt longer than the last. Finally, the screen refreshed, presenting lines of data, long strings of numbers and timestamps, a complex record of digital footprints. Monroe leaned in, tracing the activity with narrowed eyes. Her expression suddenly shifted from focused curiosity to alarm. "Wait a second," she murmured, eyes scanning the rapidly scrolling information. "This is more serious than we thought." Reed stepped closer, alarm raising the hair at the back of his neck. "What do you mean? What's it showing?" Monroe pointed to a particularly unsettling string of data. "These connections, they aren't just using his internet. They're streaming video, large amounts of data continuously moving outwards from here to multiple IP addresses." Calvin swallowed hard, the realization hitting him like an icy wave. "Video streaming," he echoed, confusion and dread mingling in his voice. "But I don't have any cameras, at least none installed intentionally." Monroe paused, her voice softer yet heavier now. "You might not, Mr. Harris, but somebody clearly does. They're using your network as a relay point." Calvin sat back, a sense of violation tightening his chest. "So someone's been spying through my Wi-Fi." Reed nodded grimly. "It seems that way. The real question now is, who's watching, and more importantly, who are they watching?" Calvin exhaled slowly, heart thumping loudly in his ears. He'd always lived quietly, carefully protecting his privacy. Now, in a single afternoon, it felt as though the walls he had built were crumbling rapidly, exposing something sinister lurking just beyond his carefully maintained solitude. Across the street, Eleanor Drake watched nervously from her window, her stomach twisting into anxious knots. Her earlier confidence had melted into uncertainty after the officers entered Calvin's home without incident. Had she misunderstood the situation entirely? Had her paranoia caused unnecessary trouble? Yet, just as she questioned her own actions, she saw another squad car pull up silently at Calvin's curb. Unmarked this time, sleek and dark, two figures emerged swiftly, dressed in plain clothes but clearly official. Eleanor's breath quickened as they entered Calvin's home. Clearly, Whatever she had accidentally uncovered had grown beyond mere suspicion. Inside Calvin's home, two newcomers introduced themselves swiftly. "Special Agent Mark Trent," said the taller man, a clean-cut agent with piercing, analytical eyes. Beside him stood Agent Olivia Perez, smaller but radiating quiet intensity. Both specialized in cybercrime. Officer Monroe briefed them quickly, her voice steady but underscored by urgency. "There's unauthorized streaming from this address. Mr. Harris claims, and we believe, he's not responsible, but someone is hijacking his Wi-Fi for surveillance." Agent Trent glanced at Calvin, quickly assessing him. Calvin maintained eye contact, unwaveringly sincere. Trent seemed satisfied. Turning to Perez, "Olivia, let's track down the precise origin of the device. We need to know how close this intruder really is." Perez nodded firmly, settling quickly beside Calvin at the table. Calvin watched with professional curiosity as she expertly navigated his system. Within minutes, she began isolating the mysterious device's exact location using triangulation techniques. Agent Perez narrowed her eyes, focused and determined. Suddenly, she froze. Trent noticed her reaction. "What is it?" "The signal this close." "Very close," she whispered, turning to Calvin. "Within 300 feet of here." Calvin's heart dropped into his stomach, dread replacing curiosity. Pinecrest Lane was peaceful, safe. Nothing bad was supposed to happen here. Agent Trent stood abruptly, the severity of the situation unmistakable. "We need to search this street. Whoever is responsible for this device is likely watching us right now." Outside, Eleanor startled when she noticed Agent Trent step out of Calvin's home, glancing sharply toward her house. Anxiety knotted tighter in her chest, imagining accusations she wasn't ready to face. But Trent's attention shifted suddenly, eyes narrowing as he surveyed other homes along the street. Eleanor's relief quickly turned to curiosity, then concern. What exactly was happening on her quiet street? Just 2 houses down from Eleanor's, behind carefully trimmed hedges, sat a modest bungalow. Gray, understated, and seemingly innocuous. Inside, Michael Evans sat hunched over his computer in a dimly lit basement room, surrounded by a wall of glowing monitors. Michael, a quiet, reclusive man in his late 20s, rarely left home. Neighbors knew little about him beyond occasional glimpses, shy smiles, silent waves. On his screens, multiple camera feeds ran continuously. Neighboring homes, interiors, front porches, driveways. All without anyone's knowledge. Michael's heartbeat quickened with excitement and fear when he realized something was happening at Calvin's home. The police cars, the plainclothes agents, it all sent a spike of adrenaline through his veins. "They found me," he whispered nervously, panic shaking his voice. No, not yet. Not now." Frantically, Michael began shutting down streams, deleting files rapidly. His fingers flew across keyboards, panic and desperation making his hands tremble. Yet he hesitated, unable to completely sever his access. His compulsion to watch, to know, overpowered even the fear of getting caught. "Just one more moment," he murmured, pleading with himself. "I need this." Back at Calvin's home, Agent Perez suddenly exclaimed triumphantly, "I've pinpointed the exact source. It's coming from number 17 Pinecrest Lane." Calvin and the officers exchanged tense, surprised glances. Calvin felt sick with betrayal. Number 17. Michael Evans' place. Quiet, awkward Michael. Always polite, if distant. Could he really be behind something so twisted? Agent Trent wasted no time, barking into his radio. "All units converge immediately at 17 Pinecrest Lane. Suspect is actively watching surveillance feeds of multiple households." Calvin's fists clenched tightly, anger mixing sharply with a deep sense of betrayal. Privacy, the one thing he'd valued most, had been ripped away by someone he'd considered harmless. As officers stormed outside, Calvin exchanged a weary glance with Officer Monroe. "All this time, the real threat was just down the street," he said bitterly. Monroe nodded sympathetically, but her eyes hardened with determination. The truth always emerges, sometimes painfully, sometimes violently, but it always comes out. Calvin turned silently toward the window, watching as agents and officers quickly approached Michael's house. He saw neighbors gather nervously, confused and frightened by the sudden chaos in their peaceful neighborhood. For the first time, Calvin recognized Eleanor standing anxiously on her porch. Her earlier accusations had hurt, yet he could now see she was genuinely frightened, as confused by events as he was. Calvin shook his head slowly, sighing deeply. "All this started because I wanted a quiet afternoon alone," he whispered to himself. Yet Calvin knew this was only the beginning, because Michael Evans' arrest was about to reveal secrets that would shatter the tranquility of Pinecrest Lane forever. The face behind the screen. Darkness clung stubbornly to the corners of the room, illuminated only by the cold, sterile glow of computer screens. Michael Evans trembled in his chair, sweat beading along his forehead as his breathing quickened. His fingers moved frantically across keyboards, trying desperately to erase months of incriminating surveillance data. The familiar comfort he'd found behind those screens had rapidly transformed into a cage, the walls now closing in. Outside, Pinecrest Lane had become a theater of confusion and anxiety. Neighbors watched from porches and driveways, murmuring anxiously as police vehicles converged around Michael's home. Calvin stood on his lawn, arms folded tightly, watching in stunned disbelief. Eleanor Drake had moved closer, clutching the collar of her cardigan, eyes wide with shock and remorse. Her earlier suspicions seemed trivial now, dwarfed by the stark reality unfolding before them. Agent Trent's voice sliced through the tense evening air as he knocked forcefully on Michael's door. "Michael Evans, federal agents, open up immediately." The command echoed sharply, met only by silence. Inside, Michael flinched at each thunderous knock. Panic welled up in his chest, thickening his breath. He glanced desperately toward the narrow basement window, a fleeting thought of escape flaring briefly. But escape to where? There was nowhere left to run. "Please, not yet," Michael whispered, voice thin with fear. Upstairs, Agent Olivia Perez gestured to Trent, her expression serious. "We can't wait. He's probably destroying evidence." Trent nodded grimly. "Take it down." With a swift nod, officers breached the door, sending it crashing open. The sound reverberated through the house, reaching Michael like an electric shock. His heart jolted, pulse hammering violently. Heavy footsteps echoed above him, moving quickly, systematically searching each room. Michael squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the edge of his desk, hands trembling. Then, abruptly, the basement door rattled violently. "Basement's locked." Someone shouted. "Suspects inside." Michael's eyes darted around, searching desperately for some final strategy. But there was nothing. With trembling fingers, he turned toward the monitor displaying Calvin Harris's now empty living room, the feed frozen on the last captured frame. Michael stared at the empty, neatly ordered room, knowing he would never watch it again. A profound emptiness filled his chest, fear mixing strangely with regret, anger, and loneliness. A final slam against the basement door shattered the lock, sending splinters of wood scattering across the stairs. Footsteps thundered downward, filling the once private sanctuary with overwhelming presence. Agent Trent stepped into the room first, weapon drawn, his eyes immediately falling upon Michael, who sat frozen at his elaborate surveillance station. "Hands up. Step away from the desk," Trent barked, his voice sharp and authoritative. Michael complied slowly, raising shaking hands, fear etched deeply across his pale, drawn features. His eyes, wide with panic, darted frantically around the room, searching for an escape he knew was impossible. Other officers quickly swarmed the room, securing computers and equipment, carefully preserving the data Michael hadn't managed to delete. Outside, Calvin saw officers escorting Michael from his house in handcuffs. Michael's eyes caught Calvin's briefly, and for a fraction of a second, something painful and vulnerable passed between them. An unspoken apology mingled with shame. Calvin's anger faltered momentarily. He had always seen Michael as harmless, shy, perhaps even lonely, but never capable of such violation. Eleanor approached Calvin cautiously, her voice trembling softly. "Calvin, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I thought." "I know." Calvin cut her off gently, not ready to absolve her fully but sensing genuine remorse in her words. "I guess none of us really knew." They stood in silence, the truth settling heavily over Pinecrest Lane. Neighbors murmured anxiously among themselves, questioning how something so dark had remained hidden beneath their idyllic facade. Hours later, beneath the sterile lights of a stark interrogation room at the police station, Michael Evans sat hunched, shoulders sagging in defeat. Agent Trent took a seat opposite him, placing an evidence folder firmly onto the table. Olivia Perez watched silently from behind the mirrored glass, arms folded tightly. Trent opened the folder slowly, pushing images toward Michael, photos captured from his computer screens, surveillance stills of neighbors in their private moments, captured without consent. Michael stared at the images blankly, eyes dulled by resignation. "You realize the severity of your actions, Mr. Evans," Trent began, his voice calm but unyielding. "Unauthorized surveillance is a serious crime. But what puzzles me is, why? Why spy on your neighbors?" Michael remained silent, eyes cast downward, refusing to meet Trent's probing gaze. Trent leaned forward slightly, voice lowering empathetically. "Help me understand, Michael. You don't have a criminal record. Your neighbors say you're quiet, respectful. This doesn't match your profile." Michael finally lifted his head slightly, voiced fragile, strained. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. It wasn't supposed to go this far." "So what was it supposed to be?" Trent pressed gently. "Just a game. Curiosity." Michael's fingers tightened nervously together. "It started as a challenge. I was bored, lonely, invisible. It felt harmless at first. I just wanted to feel connected." Trent tilted his head thoughtfully. "Connected." Michael's voice grew stronger, tinged with a strange, desperate earnestness. "I watched them because it made me feel like I mattered. For the first time, I wasn't just the weird guy down the street nobody noticed. I knew them, their habits, their lives. It made me feel like part of something." Behind the glass, Olivia Perez shook her head slowly, sadness shadowing her face. All that loneliness twisted into something sinister. She murmured quietly to Officer Monroe. Trent nodded slowly, absorbing Michael's words. "You understand these people never consented. They trusted the privacy of their own homes. Privacy you violated." Michael's voice broke painfully, tears forming in his eyes. "I know. At first, I justified it. Told myself no one was harmed. It was just watching. But eventually, it became an obsession. I couldn't stop." Trent leaned back, evaluating the broken man before him. Seeing the twisted vulnerability at the root of Michael's crimes. It didn't justify his actions, but it explained them. A desperate search for belonging, warped into a dangerous obsession. Back at Pinecrest Lane, residents remained awake long into the night, struggling with disbelief and shock. Calvin sat quietly on his porch, nursing a mug of coffee gone cold, replaying the day's events. The sense of violation lingered heavily, but something else lingered too, a painful awareness of how little he truly knew about those around him. Eleanor approached quietly, carrying her own mug, hesitating before finally sitting down beside him. "Do you think we'll ever feel safe again?" she asked softly, the night air wrapping around her words. Calvin paused thoughtfully, staring into the shadows that stretched across their street. "I think we'll heal. Eventually. But we can't pretend things will ever be exactly the same." Eleanor nodded sadly. "Maybe we never really knew each other, not the way we thought." Calvin sighed deeply, understanding dawning clearly in his expression. "I think we were all hiding from each other. Me behind my walls, Michael behind his screens, you behind your curtains. Fear creates isolation, and isolation creates misunderstanding. Eleanor met his gaze, regret playing on her aged face. I judged you wrongly, Calvin. My assumptions could have destroyed your life. I'm so sorry. Calvin held her gaze steadily, sincerity clear in his eyes. You're not the only one who learned a lesson today, Eleanor. I assumed Michael was harmless because he seemed harmless. We all make assumptions, and sometimes those assumptions can cost us dearly. They sat in silence, absorbing the painful truth illuminated by the day's events. Their street had forever lost its illusion of perfect peace. But perhaps, Calvin realized, something stronger could rise from the broken fragments. Honest connections, built on openness rather than suspicion, understanding rather than assumptions. Yet even as Calvin contemplated healing, a lingering thought troubled him deeply, whispering insistently at the back of his mind. What if Michael wasn't the only one watching? The question lingered ominously, because the shadows had been disturbed, secrets exposed, but there was still darkness that Pinecrest Lane had yet to uncover. Beneath the surface, the morning sun rose hesitantly over Pinecrest Lane, as though uncertain about disturbing a neighborhood still reeling from the shocking revelations of the night before. Early sunlight painted quiet houses in gentle hues of gold and orange, masking the turmoil that had disrupted this peaceful haven. Yet behind closed doors, suspicion and anxiety simmered quietly, spreading like an invisible virus from home to home. Calvin Harris stood at his kitchen window, sipping coffee slowly, lost in thought. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, a face etched with exhaustion, eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. He hadn't rested at all, haunted by the unsettling notion that Michael Evans might not have acted alone. The nagging suspicion refused to fade, clawing at his conscience relentlessly. A soft knock at the door pulled Calvin from his contemplation. Opening it cautiously, he found Eleanor Drake standing anxiously on his porch. Her eyes were tired, her expression still tinged with remorse from her earlier misjudgment. "Calvin, could we talk for a minute?" Eleanor asked quietly, eyes filled with uncertainty. Calvin nodded, stepping aside and gesturing for her to come in. Eleanor entered hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable but determined. She sat at his kitchen table, folding her hands nervously on its polished surface. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked gently, trying to bridge the awkward silence. Calvin shook his head, placing his mug down. "No, I couldn't. All night I kept thinking. Michael couldn't have been the only one involved. His setup was sophisticated, and he was too nervous. It just feels like there's more to this." Eleanor nodded slowly, eyes troubled. "You know, I've been thinking something similar. It's strange, Calvin. I thought I knew everyone on this street. But the more I think about it, the more I realize I've never truly known anyone here. Not really." Calvin met her gaze thoughtfully, recognizing the painful truth in her words. "We trusted the illusion of safety, Eleanor, but we never took the time to genuinely know one another. Maybe that's how something like this was able to happen." Eleanor sighed deeply. "You know, yesterday when the agents arrived, I saw someone else watching closely. Someone I wouldn't have expected." Calvin leaned forward slightly, interest piqued. "Who?" She hesitated briefly, voice lowering. "Garrett Chambers." Calvin raised an eyebrow. Garrett Chambers was a respected figure on Pinecrest Lane, a retired software engineer in his early 60s who often offered help to neighbors with computer issues. Friendly, well-spoken, and well-liked, Garrett had been the last person Calvin would have suspected. "What made you notice him?" Calvin asked cautiously, wary of falling back into unfounded suspicion. Eleanor shifted uncomfortably. He was standing near his garage, partially hidden. He seemed nervous, very unlike himself, and when they arrested Michael, Garrett didn't look surprised. He looked scared. Calvin's heart quickened slightly. "Did he see you watching?" Eleanor shook her head slightly. "No, I don't think so. But it unsettled me deeply. I wanted to dismiss it, but I couldn't." Calvin rubbed his forehead slowly, feeling the weight of yet another unsettling doubt. "Garrett has helped most of us fixed technical issues at some point. He even helped me set up my initial Wi-Fi system when I moved here. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. Could Garrett have known about vulnerabilities in our devices all along? Calvin paused, processing the implications. It felt like paranoia. But yesterday's events had taught him that paranoia might now be justified. Maybe we should speak with the agents, Calvin suggested finally. If it's nothing, Garrett will understand. But if it's something, we owe it to ourselves and everyone else here. Eleanor agreed reluctantly. I'm tired of assuming, but I'm more afraid of ignoring a real threat. Within the hour, Calvin and Eleanor found themselves sitting across from Agent Mark Trent at the local police precinct. Trent listened carefully, jotting notes down quietly. When they finished, he sat back, deeply contemplative. You think Garrett Chambers is connected? Trent questioned cautiously. He's been fully cooperative so far, offering technical support in tracing Michael's devices. Calvin leaned forward urgently. That's exactly my concern. Garrett knows our networks intimately. He'd know how to exploit them better than anyone. Agent Trent nodded slowly. I agree we should proceed carefully. I'll look into Garrett Chambers discreetly. Until then, I need you both to act normal. Don't alert him or anyone else to your suspicion. Calvin and Eleanor left the station quietly, hearts heavy. On the drive back to Pinecrest Lane, Calvin felt uneasy, anxiety tightening his chest. How had their quiet, orderly lives become so filled with distrust and hidden menace? Back at Pinecrest Lane, Garrett Chambers sat in his pristine home office, fingers tapping nervously against his polished wooden desk. His large monitors displayed surveillance logs, remote access records, and encrypted communication channels, a hidden layer of activity invisible to everyone else. Garrett had built an impressive reputation over the years, earning neighbors' trust and friendship, all while secretly exploiting their privacy. Garrett closed his eyes briefly, regret battling self-preservation. Michael's recklessness had jeopardized everything. Garrett had mentored him, taught him the basics, believing Michael was harmlessly curious. But Michael had crossed a line, becoming dangerously obsessive, endangering Garrett's carefully constructed anonymity. His phone buzzed sharply, snapping him back. Garrett's pulse quickened as he saw a single anonymous text on the screen. They're onto you. Clear everything. Now. Garrett's mouth went dry, dread washing over him like ice water. He sprang into action, swiftly dismantling his digital empire piece by piece, erasing years of illicit data and access logs. His hands trembled slightly, panic fueling urgency. He hadn't anticipated discovery. Not yet. Not like this. Yet as he scrambled to delete incriminating files, Garrett hesitated over one folder labeled simply Phase 2. Opening it, he stared at the documents inside. A detailed plan for expanding his surveillance network beyond Pinecrest Lane, accessing even more sensitive information, selling secrets discreetly to shadowy clients. Greed and power had driven him further than he'd ever intended. Suddenly, the magnitude of his choices weighed heavily upon him. Garrett leaned back slowly, his breathing uneven. The rush of secrecy, the thrill of hidden control, it had consumed him, and now it threatened to destroy everything he'd built. As evening fell upon Pinecrest Lane, Calvin sat alone again on his porch, unable to escape his anxious thoughts. Across the street, Garrett Chambers emerged from his house, visibly tense, carrying a box hurriedly to his car. Calvin watched silently, his pulse quickening. Something about Garrett's urgency felt deeply suspicious, confirming Calvin's fears. Without hesitation, Calvin called Agent Trent. Garrett Chambers is trying to leave. He looks panicked. Trent's response was immediate. Stay put. We're en route. Minutes later, Garrett's car engine roared to life, headlights slicing sharply through the twilight as he sped down Pinecrest Lane. But at the end of the street, 3 unmarked vehicles quickly blocked his path. Officers surrounded Garrett, weapons drawn, commanding him to exit the vehicle. Calvin watched from his porch, breath held tight. Garrett complied slowly, hands raised in quiet surrender, eyes downcast in shame. Eleanor joined Calvin silently, shaking her head sadly. "This is far deeper than I ever imagined," Eleanor whispered softly. Calvin exhaled slowly, sorrow mixing sharply with relief. "We were all deceived by what we saw on the surface, Eleanor. Garrett wasn't just a neighbor. He manipulated our trust for years." As Garrett was placed in the patrol car, he briefly caught Calvin's gaze, eyes filled with bitter resignation. Calvin knew he'd never understand fully why Garrett had betrayed them so profoundly. But he understood clearly that trust, once shattered, was nearly impossible to rebuild. Yet even as Garrett was led away, Calvin's heart refused to rest. A deeper unease gnawed at him, fueled by one troubling thought. Garrett had received a warning. But from whom? Because Calvin now realized Pinecrest Lane's nightmare was far from over. The hidden darkness had roots deeper than they'd ever known, stretching invisibly beneath the surface. Roots that might never fully be exposed. Breaking the illusion. Days passed slowly on Pinecrest Lane, the once vibrant neighborhood now subdued, its residents weighed down by uncertainty and suspicion. The trust that once bound them had shattered, leaving an unsettling quiet that hovered like mist over the perfectly manicured lawns and orderly homes. Calvin Harris stood at the edge of his driveway, observing his neighbors cautiously resuming their daily routines. Children played more quietly. Adults spoke briefly and hesitantly, wary of lingering eyes and hidden threats. The sense of safety they'd once taken for granted was irreparably fractured. Since Garrett Chambers' dramatic arrest, Pinecrest Lane had become a focal point for police and media alike. Cameras lingered, reporters questioned neighbors relentlessly, and whispers filled the air, each speculation darker than the last. But one question troubled Calvin above all others. Who had warned Garrett? He walked back into his home, restless. The police had removed all compromised equipment and confirmed his Wi-Fi network secure. Yet Calvin felt no safer. He'd become a prisoner of paranoia, questioning every shadow and every friendly face he encountered. A knock at the door startled him sharply. Opening it, Calvin was surprised to see Agent Mark Trent, face somber but resolute. "Mr. Harris," Trent greeted quietly, stepping inside at Calvin's invitation. "I wanted to update you personally. Garrett Chambers confessed everything. His role, his intentions, and even Michael Evans's involvement." Calvin nodded, sensing more was coming. "And the warning Garrett received?" Trent's expression darkened. "We traced the message. It originated from outside the neighborhood, routed through several encrypted servers. Whoever warned Garrett was highly sophisticated, professional, even." Calvin felt cold. "Professional? Are you suggesting someone hired Garrett?" Trent sat slowly, leaning forward. Garrett admitted as much. He was part of a larger surveillance network, gathering data on ordinary citizens. Pinecrest Lane wasn't random. It was targeted specifically for its seeming normalcy. Garrett recruited Michael, leveraging his isolation to expand surveillance. Calvin sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the sinister revelation. Why target normal people? "Information is power," Trent replied grimly. "By knowing people's secrets, financial, personal, emotional, you can manipulate outcomes, influence decisions. Garrett was selling your private lives to unknown buyers, corporate interests, blackmail operations, even political entities." Calvin stared blankly at Trent, the enormity of betrayal hitting him like a physical blow. "So all this time, we were just pawns?" Trent nodded sadly. "Yes, but exposing Garrett disrupted the network. Unfortunately, the person behind the warning message has vanished, likely moving on to another target. Still, Pinecrest Lane helped dismantle something far larger." Calvin's voice grew soft, filled with bitterness. "Yet our lives are forever changed." Trent met his gaze solemnly. "Truth always comes with a cost. But silence costs more. Without your courage, this exploitation might never have been discovered." Weeks turned into months, and gradually Pinecrest Lane began healing. Calvin became central in rebuilding trust among neighbors, advocating for transparency and encouraging deeper connections. His reserved demeanor softened. He now understood clearly that isolation and silence could breed darkness. One evening, Calvin organized a community gathering in his yard, hoping to restore some semblance of unity. Neighbors arrived hesitantly, carrying dishes and uncertainty alike. Eleanor Drake, still haunted by her misjudgment, stood quietly at Calvin's side. Calvin addressed the group gently, honestly. "We lost something precious, our sense of safety, our trust in one another. But perhaps in losing it, we gained a deeper understanding of ourselves. Pinecrest Lane won't be the same, but maybe that's a good thing. Maybe now we'll truly see one another, not just as neighbors, but as allies, as people worthy of trust and compassion." Eleanor spoke softly, voice filled with sincere regret. "My fear hurt Calvin, and made me blind to the real threat. But fear won't guide me anymore. I choose trust." The crowd murmured gently, agreeing quietly, taking tentative steps toward one another. Conversation slowly flowing, tensions easing slightly. Yet Calvin still felt restless. The unknown figure behind the surveillance network haunted him deeply. Justice remained incomplete, unfinished, leaving a lingering shadow he couldn't ignore. Months after Garrett's arrest, Calvin received an anonymous envelope in his mailbox. His heart quickened nervously as he opened it, finding a single flash drive inside labeled simply, "The Truth." Anxiously, Calvin plugged it into his computer, breath shallow with anticipation. A video opened, displaying a darkened figure, features obscured by shadow, voice electronically altered. "Mr. Harris," the voice began coldly, "you disrupted our operations significantly. Pinecrest Lane was only one of many targets. Garrett Chambers was merely an operative. You deserve to know the extent of what you've challenged." The figure continued, chillingly calm. "We operate invisibly, hidden in plain sight, watching, collecting, influencing. Garrett was weak. Michael was reckless. But others remain. You exposed a small fragment, but the network thrives. Consider this a warning. Silence your curiosity. For your own good." Calvin's hands trembled, fear mixed with anger. He stared at the screen defiantly. They wanted him afraid, silent, compliant. But silence had allowed this evil to grow unchecked. He made a decision quickly. Calvin took the flash drive to Agent Trent immediately, fully aware of the potential danger but determined not to live as a prisoner to fear. Days later, Calvin sat quietly in his yard again, reflecting deeply. Eleanor approached gently, noticing his troubled expression. "Calvin," she asked softly, "what's wrong?" He hesitated briefly before deciding honesty mattered more than fear. Calvin explained the mysterious flash drive, the threat it contained, and his resolve to fight back openly. Eleanor listened closely, expression serious. "You're risking your safety." "Yes," Calvin admitted simply. "But silence nearly destroyed us. Someone has to confront this darkness openly." She nodded quietly, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Then you won't face this alone." Word spread quickly. The entire neighborhood rallied behind Calvin, united in defiance. Reporters arrived, authorities intensified their investigations, and Pinecrest Lane became a symbol of resistance against invasive surveillance. In the months that followed, multiple arrests dismantled large sections of the surveillance network. The faceless figures who thrived in shadow found themselves forced into the light. Yet the mastermind behind it all, known only by codename The Watcher, remained elusive. Despite the lingering uncertainty, Calvin found strength in community. Pinecrest Lane reclaimed its identity, choosing openness over secrecy, trust over suspicion, unity over fear. On a calm evening, Calvin stood again on his porch, watching children playing freely, neighbors gathering openly. Eleanor approached quietly, a gentle smile on her face. "You changed things, Calvin," she said softly. "You showed us silence isn't safety." Calvin smiled warmly, feeling genuine peace for the first time in months. We changed things, Eleanor, together. They stood silently, watching Pinecrest Lane thriving again, resilient and hopeful. Yet Calvin understood the fight against darkness never truly ended. Vigilance mattered now more than ever. Calvin turned his eyes upward, stars beginning to appear. In that moment, clarity arrived gently. Fear thrives in shadows, but truth thrives in courage. And Calvin Harris knew he would never hide in silence again.